Of all the costumed crime fighters patrolling the streets of New York City, it's hard to think of two that are more different than Spider-Man and the Punisher. One is a wisecracking hero who believes that criminals deserve a chance to redeem themselves, and the other believes that criminals only deserve vengeance, and that it's his mission to deliver it to them. Those very different philosophies have caused them to repeatedly battle across the city, but at times they've joined forces and even developed a grudging respect for each other. That is, when they weren't punching each other into buildings or blasting each other with repulsor rays. How did this rivalry begin? What have been their biggest battles? And how has all of this changed both vigilantes over the years? We're here to answer all those questions and more. This is Marvel Recap: Spider-Man and Punisher, with a special shout out to the official handbook of the Marvel Universe research team for their help. To understand why these two guys from Queens were destined to clash, we have to go back and explore their tragic origin stories. Now, if you don't know Spidey's origin story, wait, how is that possible? Basically, after being bitten by a radioactive spider, nerdy Peter Parker became Spider-Man. But a selfish decision to not stop a robber led to the death of his Uncle Ben. While he was able to later capture that criminal, he also learned a lesson, that with great power must also come great, well, you know the line. Frank Castle's origin also involved a family loss, only with a very different outcome. You see, after returning home from active service in the military, Frank took his wife and kids for a picnic in Central Park. That's when they stumbled onto a gang execution. Not wanting to leave any witnesses, the gangsters gunned down Frank and his family. Only Frank survived, and after learning that the criminals wouldn't be prosecuted due to their alibis, he set out to wage a one-man war on crime. Castle went on to deliver brutal justice against organized crime as the Punisher. But as brutal as the Punisher was, his moral code stopped him from harming the innocent, and he often loaded his guns with non-lethal mercy bullets that were filled with a powerful sedative. And with such different approaches to crime fighting, it was inevitable that these two would clash. The Punisher's first appearance in Amazing Spider-Man number 129 was also the first meeting of these two crime fighters. The mad geneticist known as the Jackal convinced the Punisher that Spider-Man was a murderer. The Punisher ambushed Spidey on a rooftop, but the Jackal intervened, sending Spider-Man tumbling over the edge. Of course, he survived, but the Punisher was furious with the Jackal as he didn't want to become a common murderer by letting a man fall to his death. Later, Spidey followed the vigilante and managed to convince the Punisher of his innocence. Spidey probably should have tried harder though, as most of their early encounters involved the Punisher becoming convinced that Spider-Man was a criminal. For example, when they next crossed paths in Amazing Spider-Man number 134, the Punisher became convinced that Spider-Man was working with the villain Tarantula to help rob a New York City tour boat. But after realizing his error, the Punisher teamed up with Spidey to help take Tarantula down before escaping again into the night. However, the Punisher still wasn't done suspecting Spidey of criminal acts. The Amazing Spider-Man number 162 found the Punisher on the trail of a sniper who was targeting tourists in Coney Island, one who was also being tracked down by Spidey and the X-Man Nightcrawler. After discovering Nightcrawler and Spidey battling on the Roosevelt Island tram, the Punisher became convinced that one of them had to be the sniper and battled them both, only to be targeted by the actual killer. The trio later cornered the culprit, who turned out to be a then-nameless minor thug that the Punisher had previously disfigured by throwing him through a window. The Punisher couldn't even remember who he was, but that thug would become Jigsaw, one of the Punisher's longest-running foes. While Spidey clearly wasn't a fan of the Punisher, he hadn't really come face-to-face with the brutality of the Punisher's methods. That changed in Giant-Size Spider-Man number 4, when the two traveled to South America to stop the weapons dealer Moses Magnum, who was peddling a toxic, flesh-melting gas. The two worked together to defeat Magnum's army. Then Spidey faced off against the villain, only for the Punisher to fire at a gas canister held by Magnum, exposing him to his own deadly weapon. Afterwards, Spidey asked the Punisher if he'd heard his warning about the deadly gas canister. And yeah, he'd heard Spidey's warning. He just didn't care. However, Spidey was able to put aside his misgivings towards the Punisher's methods when lives were on the line. For example, when Daily Bugle editor J. Jonah Jameson was taken hostage by the terrorist People's Liberation Front. The Punisher's loyalties were tested when he learned that his life had once been saved during the war by the PLF's hired mercenary, the Hitman. During a showdown on top of the Statue of Liberty, the Punisher was forced to decide between saving Spider-Man and Jameson or letting the Hitman plummet to his death. He chose Spider-Man. Afterwards, Spider-Man tried to comfort the Punisher by saying that maybe the Hitman was finally at peace. The Punisher hoped Spidey was right and that the war was finally over for the Hitman. The Punisher's war, however, may go on forever. But while the Punisher may have respected Spider-Man enough to save him instead of his old army buddy, he didn't feel the same way about Peter Parker. While investigating the death of an old friend at the hands of crime boss Lorenzo Jacoby, the Punisher became convinced that Parker was working with the gang leader. After all, if Parker wasn't part of Jacoby's gang, how else could he get such great pictures of the Punisher and Spider-Man fighting his goons? The Punisher broke into Parker's apartment and confronted him at gunpoint about working for Jacoby. Luckily, Parker was able to convince the Punisher that he had a deal with Spider-Man to take pictures of his crime fighting. Parker pretended to get a message to Spider-Man, and then he teamed up with the Punisher to take down the gang. Spidey stopped the Punisher from killing Jacoby, only for the drug dealer to get run down by a car driven by one of his own fleeing men. The Punisher warned Spidey that one day he would understand that granting mercy to scum was a tragic mistake. But Spidey answered that the day he does, he hoped he'd have the sense to retire. Spidey's growing distrust of the Punisher came to a head after the Punisher murdered the Great Turhan, a criminal guru. Spidey and the Punisher investigated Turhan's criminal ties, which led them to Dr. Octopus's plan to poison the Daily Bugle's ink supply. When the Punisher became contaminated by the poison, he attacked Spider-Man, who cured him and left him for the police. Spidey went on to defeat Doc Ock, and when the Punisher was captured by the cops, he was fine with going to jail. After all, there are lots of criminals there. One of those criminals happened to be Jigsaw, who took the opportunity to poison Frank's food, slowly driving him mad. Under the poison's influence, the Punisher conned Boomerang into a jailbreak and then went on a killing spree, taking the lives of even minor criminals. The Punisher was arrested again and put on trial, which Spidey attended as Peter Parker. When Punisher was sentenced to a mental institution, he snapped and, still under the influence of Jigsaw's drugs, declared that the state was insane for letting criminals go free. Frank's lawyer explained that he wasn't going to prison, but to a hospital. He just needed to convince the doctors that he was right, that only he could save society. But that broke Castle, as he knew he couldn't convince them. They think society's being run correctly, and you can't reason with crazy people. As Frank was escorted out of the courtroom, Peter was left wondering whether what happened to the Punisher would ever happen to Spider-Man. Eventually, the drugs wore off, and Frank was transferred to Rikers Island Prison, where he took his revenge on Jigsaw before the warden let him escape to continue his war on crime. And when a gang war broke out, the Punisher decided to end it by blowing up a meeting of gang leaders. Spider-Man stopped him, saving the lives of all those gangsters. Spidey tried to capture him, only to find that the Punisher had rigged himself with knockout gas, and the Punisher escaped into the night to continue his war on crime. We've been focusing on Spidey's growing anger towards the Punisher's killings, but what did the Punisher think of Spidey? We found a hint in Spectacular Spider-Man number 140, where they reluctantly teamed up to track down evidence against the superhuman hitman, Tombstone. The Punisher ended up mind-controlled by the Persuader and working as his enforcer. When Spider-Man found the Punisher, the Persuader ordered Frank to kill the wall crawler. But the Punisher snapped out of his mind control, as killing an innocent, even someone like Spider-Man, was something he'd never do. Instead, he shot the Persuader, and when Spider-Man argued that killing was wrong, the Punisher replied, "You live by your moral code, Spider-Man, and I'll live by mine." Despite that ominous goodbye, there were signs that Spider-Man's moral code was starting to influence the Punisher. In Punisher War Journal number 14, they teamed up to protect a family that was threatened by a group of neo-Nazis. The Punisher drew his gun, but Spider-Man intervened, insisting there would be no cold-blooded killing today. Instead, Spidey webbed up the attackers and left them for the police. Meanwhile, the rest of the Nazis attacked the Daily Bugle, taking publisher J. Jonah Jameson and Spider-Man's wife, Mary Jane, hostage. The Punisher and Spider-Man infiltrated the building to free them, only to learn that the terrorists had killed an entire SWAT team and a hostage. With that, the Punisher declared that he was done with restraint, and Spider-Man better take the kid gloves off, or else another hostage might be killed. While Frank battled the soldiers in the Bugle's printing plant, Spidey confronted the group's leader, who held Mary Jane at gunpoint. Spider-Man threatened to rip the man apart if he harmed her, only for the leader to toss her out the window. Spidey managed to web her to safety, and Jameson took out the leader with some two-fisted journalism. Meanwhile, Punisher spared the life of two of the group's members, thinking, "That spider idiot must be getting to me." But when he secretly witnessed Peter happily reunited with Mary Jane, even the Punisher had to admit it was a job well done. While Spider-Man and Punisher had managed to maintain an uneasy partnership for several more adventures, it came to an end in the pages of 1993's Spider-Man number 32. It started when faked footage of Spider-Man murdering people was released to the public. This turned out to be part of a plan to destroy Spidey by the supervillain, the Master of Vengeance. The Punisher hunted down the fake Spider-Man, only to fight the real Spidey. As for Spider-Man, he declared that the Punisher's career was over and sought to take him to the police. They argued over the Punisher's brutal methods, with Spider-Man telling him that justice didn't need killing. But the Punisher just scoffed, saying, "That's good from someone who bends steel in their hands. But what do the rest of us do?" The Punisher tracked down the Master of Vengeance, only to find he'd poisoned himself from drinking an experimental potion designed to give him superpowers. But poisoning was too slow a death for the busy Punisher, who was about to finish the Master off when Spidey burst through a window. Spidey webbed up the Punisher just as the Master of Vengeance recovered. Suddenly, Spidey found himself fighting for his life. The Punisher managed to free himself from the wall, burning himself with sulfuric acid to get free of Spidey's webbing. During the battle, the Master of Vengeance became trapped in the floor, and his electrical suit started to overload. Spidey tried to save the villain, only to be knocked out and carried to safety by the Punisher, just before the Master of Vengeance exploded. Spidey was furious, saying that the Master of Vengeance deserved a chance to change. Spider-Man was determined to stop the Punisher, who claimed that Spidey would have to kill him to do it. Spider-Man leapt at him, only to face a return from the Master of Vengeance. As they struggled, the Punisher got the supervillain in his crosshairs, only missing him due to some last-minute maneuvering from Spider-Man. Later that night, Peter was left thinking about how many times he'd let the Punisher go. He vowed that the next time they met would be the last time for one of them, whatever it took. Their next showdown came in the one-shot Spider-Man Punisher Sabretooth Designer Jeans. where the two investigated a series of vicious murders, seemingly perpetuated by, you guessed it, the animalistic mutant Sabretooth. When Spidey wouldn't allow Punisher to kill Sabretooth, they tracked the killer to the Bronx Zoo, where they were forced to battle an enclosure of lions. As the Punisher was about to finish off Sabretooth, Spidey stopped him. Sabretooth claimed that he was framed, as the murders had been done by his clone, which was created by a scientist from Sabretooth's days in the Canadian Weapon X program. Sabretooth's pleas of innocence were undercut when he slashed the Punisher's throat and escaped. Spidey managed to save the Punisher's life by using his webbing to stop the bleeding, but the Punisher refused to stop the hunt, and the two tracked the scientist to his lab. There, they were forced to fight the real killer, the scientist's younger brother, who had been saved from cancer by genetic manipulation that turned him into a Wolfman. After Spidey defeated the Wolfman, he discovered that Sabretooth had killed the scientist. Spider-Man moved to take on the Punisher, only to be interrupted by guards. The two went their separate ways, with Spider-Man convinced that their final confrontation was inevitable. That confrontation finally happened in the pages of Punisher War Journal number 67, when the Punisher was framed for the murder of some New York police officers. Convinced that the Punisher had killed a cop and furious at himself for letting the Punisher operate for all this time, Spider-Man managed to capture him and left him for the police organization Vigil. Actually, it turned out Spidey left Frank with some villains posing as Vigil agents, but the Punisher managed to escape anyway. The two came to blows again in Spider-Man Power of Terror number 4, when Punisher tried to execute Deathlock, arguing that the cyborg wasn't alive anymore. But Spidey argued that all human life is precious, which is one of the most uplifting things you can say while beating another man senseless. But while Spider-Man was willing to take on the Punisher when needed, he still respected him. We saw that in The Punisher, number 17, when the police asked Spidey to help them hunt the vigilante. Spidey refused, telling them that the Punisher was tough, mean, and scary. But he's also human, however much he tries to deny it. He's got a sense of honor, duty, and justice, and a sense of mission. He and I both share that. But that respect didn't mean that Spidey wanted to work with him anymore. During the Spider Hunt storyline, Spidey was blamed for the kidnapping of corrupt businessman Norman Osborn's grandson, Normie. Spider-Man found himself being hunted across the city by a pack of bounty hunters, and Osborn convinced the Punisher, who was suffering from amnesia, to join in the hunt. After remembering that he'd worked side by side with Spider-Man, the Punisher tried to help him, only for Spidey to refuse his aid. But even after the wall crawler webbed him up, the Punisher still had Spider-Man's back. He was able to persuade the bounty hunter Shotgun to stop pursuing Spidey, ironically, at gunpoint. The two managed to stop the other bounty hunters, while Spidey rescued Normie from the Green Goblin and returned him to Grandpa Norman, aka the Green Goblin. Yes, Norman staged this kidnapping, creating a fake goblin and everything, just to protect his own secret identity. All that, and Norman made sure Spidey never got the credit for the save. Finally, fed up with the Punisher's body count, Spidey teamed up with Daredevil and Wolverine to try and take him down. But the Punisher was able to take them down by blasting Wolverine with a rocket launcher and unleashing the Hulk on them. Afterwards, the Punisher told the defeated heroes that there was only one way to stop him, by stopping him permanently. And if they weren't going to do it, they were wasting his time. And with that lesson, Spidey dropped his pursuit of the Punisher, and the pair entered into an uneasy stalemate. While Spidey may have been holding a grudge against the Punisher, the feeling wasn't mutual. We saw that during the superhuman conflict known as Civil War, when Spider-Man defected from Tony Stark's pro-registration side. On the run, he was chased down and almost killed by the supervillains Jack-O-Lantern and Jester, only to be saved when the Punisher shot them. He then carried the unconscious Spider-Man to the hidden lair of Captain America's anti-registration forces. Cap soon learned that Punisher had been secretly helping his anti-registration side by covering their backs, and Cap reluctantly let him join his team. Punisher proved his worth by breaking into the Baxter Building and stealing intel, and he even shared a little friendly banter with Spidey. That is, until the supervillains Goldbug and Plunderer tried to join Cap's team, and the Punisher gunned them down. Furious, Cap attacked him, but the Punisher refused to fight back. You see, the Punisher had a deep respect for the World War II legend, something that we saw when they met back in Captain America number 241. Steve threw Punisher out of the hideout and off of his team. After having his life saved by the Punisher, Spidey seemed to warm up to him a little. In Punisher War Journal number 13, Spidey only gave Punisher a brief lecture after stopping him from killing the Rhino. In fact, Peter told him that he knew that Frank was a good guy, or wanted to be anyway. Later, the Punisher followed the Rhino to the lair of Kraven the Hunter, who had been hunting and capturing animal-themed supervillains. And maybe Spidey was right about the Punisher, because after defeating Kraven, he spared the Rhino by letting him swim to safety. But the Punisher wasn't going soft on crime, as Peter learned when he ran into the Punisher on the street. Frank was planning to ambush arms dealer Moses Magnum, who had survived his apparent death by melting. After a brutal battle on Magnum's boat, Spider-Man was ready to take the Punisher in, but Frank revealed that he'd shot Magnum in the stomach. Spidey was forced to let the Punisher go to save Magnum's life. We really got to see their different approaches to crime fighting when Deadpool was framed for an act of terrorism in the miniseries Deadpool Suicide Kings. Spider-Man and Punisher both tried to track the Merc down, with the Punisher using seemingly lethal force. He blew off Deadpool's head, which luckily regenerated. Punisher later realized Deadpool was innocent and decided to help him pursue the real enemy, Tombstone. Meanwhile, Spider-Man tracked down Deadpool with slightly less head-exploding means. Spider-Man and Deadpool battled the Wrecking Crew, only to find they were outmatched. That's when they got an unexpected assist from the Punisher, who arrived on the Green Goblin's glider, armed with gear he had stolen from various villains he'd fought over the years. Deadpool defeated Tombstone and even got a confession from the gangster in front of Spider-Man and the Punisher. Their team-up continued in the Shadowland miniseries, which saw Spider-Man and Punisher join a team of street-level heroes as they resisted a takeover of New York City by a beast-possessed Daredevil. And by beast, we mean the demon affiliated with the ninja clan known as the Hand, not the furry X-Man who's best buds with Wonder Man. But the Punisher and Spider-Man's working relationship started to sour in Spectacular Spider-Man number 1000, where they worked together to take out a drug ring. Despite agreeing to use non-lethal methods, the Punisher still gunned down a bunch of gangsters. Spider-Man was even forced to stop Frank from killing a teenaged criminal. Spidey complained that working with Punisher led to too many bodies, while the Punisher complained that working with Spider-Man meant that not enough got done. Despite their feelings, they were able to work together as part of a team with Daredevil and the Punisher's protege, Rachel Cole Alves. Their mission? Protect a repository of information on organized crime known as the Omega Drive from the assassins of the Hand. Oh, and if it looks weird to you, that's because the Omega Drive was encoded onto the unstable molecules from a uniform of the Fantastic Four. Considering their last encounter, it's surprising that Spidey got the trigger-happy Punisher and Cole Alves to agree to one night with 0 fatalities. But the biggest showdown between Spider-Man and the Punisher took place in the pages of the 2012 miniseries Punisher Warzone. After the Omega Drive incident, the Punisher used one of Spidey's web shooters to infiltrate a meeting of the criminal organization called The Exchange, which resulted in a number of deaths and the capture of Rachel Cole Alves. Spidey tracked down the Punisher's van, furious that he'd used something he created to kill. Spidey explained that he thought Frank was a lunatic who needed to be locked up until he evolved into something more responsible, like a mollusk, and the Punisher's murderous run was over. Spider-Man told him, "You're done." To which Frank replied, "I'm done when I'm dead, kid." They fought, and Spidey pointed out that the Punisher isn't the only person to have lost the people he loves. He's just the guy who turned it into an excuse to commit murder. While Spidey was able to knock out Frank, he fell victim to a well-placed grenade. The Punisher escaped, taking another of Spidey's web shooters with him. In response, Spidey called together a meeting of the Avengers, demanding that they bring in this mass murderer. They weren't interested until Captain America agreed, saying that by letting the Punisher go free, they're condoning what he does and making their own law. Cap also agreed that they couldn't just give the Punisher to the cops, so he asked Tony Stark to come up with some place to imprison him. But Cap asked Spider-Man to stay out of the fight, saying he was a little too invested. However, Wolverine sympathized with the Punisher and warned him about the Avengers' plans. Meanwhile, the Punisher's partner, Rachel Cole Alves, was facing murder charges for her work with the Punisher. Over the next couple issues, the Punisher managed to outmaneuver the Avengers team. After using Thor to take down a group of Indonesian arms merchants, the Thunder God shared a drink with him and warned him about the danger of losing oneself to the madness of battle. The Punisher's partner would soon die for his cause. Was that what he fought for? Moved by Thor's words, Frank returned to New York and used his skills and a stolen suit of Iron Man armor to take down the Avengers and free Cole Alves. Frank managed to get her to an abandoned carnival in White Plains, New York, where he gave her everything she'd need to escape into Canada with Wolverine. But for the plan to work, Frank had to stay and fight the Avengers, a battle he knew he couldn't win. But he would sacrifice his mission, his war, if she could escape. And while he held his own against the Avengers, eventually he listened to Captain America and stood down. The Avengers sealed the Punisher up in an underwater prison in Lake Michigan known as the Bone. Afterwards, Spidey pointed out that the Punisher had gone out of his way to not murder them, even using rubber bullets and keeping his pistol unloaded. They'd managed to lock Frank up, but Spidey didn't feel like they'd won. Cap responded that they didn't. They took him to war, and in a war, nobody gets to feel like they won. And we soon saw that Frank's war continued, as Cole Alves was in Los Angeles, working as a new Punisher. Of course, the Punisher eventually escaped from his watery prison and returned to his mission to battle the criminals across the country. Since then, Spider-Man and the Punisher have only had brief run-ins, often as part of large team-ups, or when the Avengers tried to take him down after Nick Fury gave him the War Machine armor to battle enemies outside the United States. But the pair will finally be crossing paths in 2 new limited series, with Spectacular Spider-Man Brand New Day launching in May, while the alternate reality story Spider-Man Long Way Home hits in June. But as long as the Punisher believes in his never-ending war on crime, while Spider-Man believes, with great power must also come great responsibility, you can be sure they'll still be on the streets of New York, fighting criminals and often each other. And that is our abridged summary of the rivalry between Spider-Man and the Punisher. Want to learn more? Sign up for Marvel Unlimited, where you can see Spider-Man and the Punisher's many battles and team-ups. And you can pick up Spectacular Spider-Man Brand New Day and Spider-Man Long Way Home wherever your favorite comics are sold. If you're curious, here's the full list of comics referenced in this video. This has been Marvel Recap: Spider-Man and Punisher.